In this presentation, I will demonstrate how to take a CA ERwin Data Modeler file and export the metadata out to a business intelligence tool, in this case, Business Objects from SAP. First, we have an ERwin model, and as you can see, there's a dimensional information defined already in this model, so we're going to make use of that information when we export out to Business Objects. In addition, you'll note that when I look at these particular elements, there's documentation information. There is, of course, also the particular column properties. So we have, for example, comments. We have the SQL Server types defined, etc. Everything available here within the model. Now, this is very important because for most business intelligence tools, and Business Objects is one of them, we find that when you point directly at the database and reverse engineer from there, a lot of information is not captured. Of course, the descriptive information, that's an obvious example, but also the dimensional characteristics. A lot of dimensional models do not have foreign key primary key relationships. All the IDs, or in other words, the unique identifiers for dimensions, etc., are referred to as ID. And therefore, when that model is reverse engineered into the business intelligence tool, it doesn't have enough information to create an accurate OLAP model for it. In this case, all that information has been placed in ERwin and modeled very well so that we can use that information when we are connecting and actually exporting out to the business objects format, the universe file. So I'm going to use the export bridge here. First, I'm going to make sure that this model is saved and export out to an external format, in this case, Business Objects. Now, of course, you can specify characteristics about the source and the destination. In this case, we're talking about importing from an ERwin file, this ERwin file that I have open. So you can specify different parameters for the bridge, and note as I click through the parameters, it changes the tooltips at the bottom so you can understand what the specifications are. I'm going to use the default here for the source side, but on the destination side, I'm going to specify SAP Business Objects Designer as a file. So I'm going to create a universe file. Note there are a lot of tooltips associated with this bridge. It is very important that you read these in detail. The Business Objects bridge does make a direct connection to the API of Business Objects. So you must have Business Objects installed on the same machine, and also you must make sure that you use a connection, in other words, a database connection, as defined by Business Objects. And you refer to that in the particular bridge parameter here. Note I'm specifying a particular universe. In this case, I'm creating one that's in CTemp. This universe does not have to exist. If it already does, it will either overwrite, or depending on how I define options within this bridge, it will update or replace elements. In addition, I need to specify the particular machine that I'm going to connect to that has the Business Objects Repository, or CMS. And I'm specifying enterprise type authentication, so I'm going to give it a user ID and password. It's always best that you use an administrator one, because while you aren't updating anything in the repository, still this way you have full access to all the characteristics of the connection, which is critical. Note also I'm going to go ahead and create everything and refresh from the database. So it'll create an entire OLAP model, and it'll refresh the physical architecture based on my database connection. And my database connection, this MIDI pay purse warehouse, is in fact the same connection name that you see within Business Objects. So if I'm in Business Objects Designer, for example, and I look at my connections and scroll down, you'll see this particular connection is defined, and it has a connection specified into a particular database out there. Give it a second to make that connection and validate, and you can see MIDI pay purse warehouse as the connection. So when I test, I should see that in fact it is the correct connection and it is working. Now, another thing about the Business Objects Bridge that is very important, it's important to make sure that you close Designer or any Business Objects applications on the machine that's running the export bridge from ERwin. The reason is it's a COM-based API. There's a lot of COM-based conflicts that can occur if you have other instances of business objects running on this same machine. So I made sure it's closed. I also, as I mentioned, can specify how we determine, for example, the dimensional modeling characteristics. So in other words, how my OLAP model is going to be built up. Well, I'm going to use all this good dimensional information that has been defined within ERwin. So I say as defined in the source model. Of course, it could try to auto-detect it from a relational schema if this were just a relational database defined within ERwin without dimensional characteristics. And of course I could manually specify facts and dimensions, and then there are all sorts of options where you can specify what those are. In addition, I can either overwrite, in other words, create everything within that universe, or I can start updating the information within the universe if there's already an existing one and all I want to do is update. And so I have that option as well. And then the specifications of how to match for updates and what I'm going to change for each of these. Again, read through these options. Note that the tooltips are there. I'm not going to use any of those options. I'm starting with a fresh universe and exporting straight out to the universe file. All right, so I'm done here. I'll go ahead and click on Finish. Note ERwin then exports the file out to XML format. And then after that is done, it's going to go ahead and connect into Business Objects and validate that connection, create a physical side to the model based on that database connection, and then create the OLAP model and all the select statements required to refer back to that physical model based on the connection and based on the dimensional characteristics that were defined within this model. Okay, it's finished. Note it says export completed successfully. I close this out. And now I look at my universe. And here it is. So I double click on it, connect into the CMS. And what you see is in fact the same thing that we saw in ERwin, even to the point of the layout. So for example, let's scroll up a little bit and over, and you'll see the same characteristics, the same layout, physical positioning layout that we see here in ERwin, you'll see also in Business Objects. And of course, we also get all the information that we already had in ERwin. We'll see it in Business Objects. So for example, when I look at the properties for this particular measure, then what we see is the definitions and all the same definitional information that we saw in ERwin. In addition, if I look at the individual elements within here, we'll look at the properties, and you see, for example, the descriptive information, the data type. Now understand, Business Objects has a very limited collection of data types. So this came originally as a varchar, more likely. Let's go ahead and look at that element. And yes, it was a varchar 15. Well, within Business Objects, of course, we only have 4 choices, and character is the best example in this case. And then note again, we have the description, and as I said, even the select statement required to get back to the physical object within the database. Now these are pretty much one for one because we've defined a dimensional model based on a relational underlying database, the Snowflake database, and so these are going to be fairly simple select statements in this case. But nevertheless, everything that you need to get a huge start on your model is right here. all in Business Objects.